This video is sponsored by LogRocket, the front-end performance monitoring application that gives you the power to see why bugs are happening and experience them just like your users. Try today at logrocket.com/YT.
Hey developers, how's it going? Today's topic is more of a question. Why aren't people using new CSS features? In web development especially, it is so easy to hit that state of information overload, even though there's just so much stuff out there that is useful, delightful, has a bunch of utility, a bunch of use cases. Sometimes a lot of this stuff is just off our radar. And today, I want to change things up and talk about 5 CSS features that maybe should be on your radar. If you're a front-end developer, a designer, full stack, doesn't matter. These features that I'm showing today have lots of use cases and can really make your applications shine just a little brighter. So without further ado, let's jump into these. Just to give a little outline of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to talk about initial letter. Ooh, that's a really good one. It's so simple. The syntax is just dead simple. I think this is one of my favorites. When I do see the implementations, when it's done correctly, it just makes content pop so much more than when you don't use it. We're going to talk about logical properties and values rather than physical layout mappings. The logical properties and values targets logical layout and mappings. It's a lot of words I just said there. We're going to talk about that as soon as we click on this in a few minutes. We're also going to be talking about scroll snapping. Has a lot of use cases. This is also a very aesthetically pleasing CSS feature. CSS supports. This is a utilitarian feature, and 2 examples here just because it is kind of hard to illustrate if I don't have Internet Explorer or Opera Mini. Those browsers seem to be the ones that generally don't have so much support with CSS. And then finally, we're going to talk about Subgrid. I think of all of these, though, in a few months, Subgrid is just, you're going to be seeing a lot of tutorials, you're going to be seeing a lot of blog posts, a lot of content focused on Subgrid because it does have to do with the grid, which really changed a lot. It changed the game as far as layout goes in CSS. Let's check out initial letter. As I mentioned earlier, the syntax with this one is just so dead simple and it immediately transforms content. If you are a content creator, even learning just a little bit of CSS, if you're not a day-to-day coder, can really help. Now, fortunately, a lot of content management systems, I'm going to show you one of them in just a moment. They do have this option. WordPress, for example, when you're composing your blog post, there's just an option on the right through the graphical user interface to just click a button and the initial letter is capitalized like this. And it just creates such a nice, sophisticated effect with minimal code. What I'm doing here, I'm targeting the paragraph with a pseudo element, first letter. Now, I'm just going to illustrate here what this does. So if I turn this to first line, whoops, if I could spell it correctly, that whole first line is a whopper. We just want to say first letter. And what this does for the reader is that it implies a new paragraph and a new thought, and it really emphasizes it. So if we took this out, actually, you know what? I'm not going to take this out. I'm going to show you an example here. If you've ever visited medium.com, read articles there, or written your own, this is an example of that in action. This first letter, it just makes it look sharp. Disclaimer though, this is not going to look good on everything you write. As you can see here, you really have to play around with it, with your font, your size, your margins, and your padding, really to make it look appropriate. If you're doing a tutorial or something, for every paragraph, this isn't going to look so good. The next feature I have to show you is logical properties and values. I haven't seen a lot of people use this, but when you are using physical properties, now I want to be sure I'm telling you guys this to the T, so I'm not adding any confusion. Logical properties and values provide control of layout through logical rather than physical direction and dimension mappings. So the benefit of that is that sometimes when you are using the logical layout, for example, go back to my example here, text-align right. That's a physical mapping. That's a physical layout. When you use that, sometimes these things get lost in translation if you're using something like Flexbox, if you're targeting if you're maybe more accessibility minded, or you're targeting an international audience where people are reading left to right, some people are reading right to left, and you need to be more accessible that way. When you use something like text-align right, things can get out of control fairly quickly. And that is just one example of when you would use logical properties and values. And so what I mean by logical properties and values, you are using logical positions rather than physical positions. So in this example, I guess I should say rectangles. The first one has a text-align of end. That's an example of a logical value. Whereas in my second rectangle, I have text-align right. That is a physical value. And that's where, again, as I just mentioned earlier, that is where some problems can start happening. This one is really context dependent. So when you're assessing the needs for your content and your project and who your target audience is, if you have a large international audience, if you're using Flexbox, there's a few other use cases, I won't go through them all. Just keep in mind that these logical properties and values help prevent bugs, mistakes, and poor user experiences. So even though, you really don't hear about this one a lot, at least I haven't seen it a lot, but this can help prevent these kind of issues when your readership is diverse, or you're using features where physical mappings just aren't the best choice. Now we have logical properties and values. The third one I want to show you on this list, the third feature, is called scroll snapping. Now what this does essentially is let you determine where you want to snap to as your user is going through blocks or pieces of content that you create. You also have different properties. For example, the scroll snap type property, that's going to set how strictly the snap points are enforced on this container. So let's just go through some of these things, some of these new these properties and values here. Scroll snap type on container 2, both mandatory. So that, as the name suggests, this is a mandatory snap. Going down here, we have a container 2 div, scroll snap align start. I used a few different properties here, and this is just targeting the different blocks I have here with different colors so you can see the differences. Here's my cursor in this little box, and it's not a fluid scroll. So if I'm only scrolling a little bit, it's not going to snap to the next block. If I force my way down using my trackpad here, it snaps to the fourth one. As I swipe, if I'm only doing a little bit, it won't snap. Only when I give a definitive, okay, I want to go to the next one, does it snap to the next number. I'm going down here, same thing. I didn't style these, but you guys get the picture. And this is just, wow, giving the user, this is just so cool, giving the user that control, but also controlling their experience. This is almost like an interactive table. There are lots of use cases for this one. And look at this. It snaps on all of these. So 8, oops, let's just go through it. We have 1, 4, 7, and I'm going to snap here. Now I'm going to go up and snap. I'm going to go 8, whoops, a little too excited with that one. 8, now snap. 5, now snap 2. 3, snaps to 6, snaps to 9. As the MDM web docs point out, there are different types of scroll snaps. You don't have to use mandatory, you can use none. And this is just going to be your traditional scroll. There aren't any roadblocks here. Mandatory, now this is just the same example that I use in the code pen. Unless I give it a real definitive push here, it's not going to snap to the next one. Now this one, unfortunately, isn't going to make your eyes pop open. I don't really have a beautiful demo for this because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is more for utilitarian purposes. What do I mean by that? Well, let's, for example, take the grid. The grid, a powerful layout tool in CSS, relative newcomer. It's been around, long enough, but it still is kind of fresh for some of these browsers, and not all browsers support it. So basically, what supports does is I guess you could say it runs a query against your browser of choice. And if your browser doesn't display grid, for example, then we have we're telling the browser to take another route. And in this case, I want my browser to use Flexbox. So supports here, if my browser indeed supports grid, this page is going to show me a grid. If my browser does not, it's going to show me a Flexbox. Now, if we go to caniuse.com, let's just run this and see what browsers don't support grid. Fortunately, all of the biggies do. Even Edge, AD is supporting it. Supports is just a really good safety net. So if you are using grid or any other major thing, check out this property, check out supports, and then have a backup plan if the browser does not support it. Because one of the worst user experiences possible, if not the worst, is clicking on something or trying to read something and nothing shows up. It's just a blank screen. You just lost a customer. So definitely important to have a backup plan with these newer features that we're all excited about. A lot of people aren't using the newest versions of Chrome and Firefox. So just keep that in mind. This is another example of CSS supports. This text will display pink if your browser supports CSS variables. Otherwise, it'll be gray. And as you can see right here, my browser of choice right now is supporting CSS variables. And really, this is another example of Opera Mini being the browser that just isn't supporting this type of thing. So basically, the subgrid allows nested grids to be a part of the sizing of their parent grids. And this is important because once we start fleshing out these websites and building these websites, it can get out of control pretty quickly with all the content that we are producing inside the grid. And the grid is hard enough, the grid is tricky enough to learn, but once you start nesting grids and these different values and different browsers and different developers with their different styles and different conventions, there are a lot of variables going on with just the CSS side, with just the design side. So this, I don't want to say it standardizes things, but it's giving you the opportunity to make a cleaner layout, a layout that makes more sense to developers. So what's going to happen with a subgrid is that it's going to inherit any column or row gap set on your parent grid, but that can be overruled by column and row gaps that you specify on the subgrid. And also with this spec, we're getting two new values: template columns along with grid template rows properties. And this is going to let us establish the subgrid within an existing grid container. So already they're throwing out the syntax, they're throwing out some teasers here. So to recap, the features that I showed you today were initial letter, logical properties and values, scroll snapping, CSS supports, and subgrid. Developers, this is just a tiny sampling of newer CSS features. And to answer the question, why aren't people using new CSS features? Well, number one, some of them are so new, we just don't have the justification to dive so deep into them just yet. And number two, a lot of this stuff just isn't on our radar. There's so much going on in web development, so much going on with CSS, these new releases, these new updates and upgrades, browser compatibility, that they're just not on our radar. So hopefully this video did put them on your radar and you learned a little something of how to make your CSS pop a little more, make your content shine a little brighter. Thanks for watching as always, and we'll see you in the next video.